Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tim, a beef and corn farmer from Bridgnorth, Shropshire, and I farm in partnership with my parents. At any one time, we fatten about 500 beef cattle on our farm, mainly Holstein cross bullocks. The farm comprises of 632 acres, half of which was purchased in 2006, when two of our neighbours decided to sell their farms. The next few years were quite tough for us, actually. We always seemed to be suffering a cash flow crisis. The price of beef was languishing, and the price of corn was very volatile. I always seemed to be selling it at the wrong time. I therefore decided to apply for a Nuffield scholarship, in the hope that I could look out into broader horizons and bring things back into my own business, which would send it forward. Having been awarded my award, I then sat down to discover exactly what I wanted to achieve from it. I wanted to have a look at growth promoters and hormones, and I also wanted to have a look at bioethanol plants and biodigesters. But more importantly, I wanted to take a look at various fattening systems, not just the intensive beef system, but also a pastoral-based system. The obvious first choice country for me to go to was America, where big is beautiful, and I sought to find an example of the closed-loop system. This is where grain is fed into a bioethanol plant to produce ethanol. The byproduct of this process, distillers' grains, is then fed into a feedlot which is adjacent to the ethanol plant. The muck from this system then goes into a biodigester to create a biogas, which in turn then goes back into the bioethanol plant to run it. However, in 2008, when the price of grain spiked, it couldn't compete with the cheap price of crude oil, and therefore many of the bioethanol plants were mothballed and shut down. This then had an effect of creating a shortage of distillers' grains available to the feedlot, which in turn affected their profitability. None more so than the Friona Industries feedlot in Amarillo, Texas. Here, where big is beautiful, 85,000 cattle are fattened at any one time. And I was absolutely astounded to realise that in 2009, they'd only made $1 a head. I asked the manager why he couldn't set the price with the feedlot of this size. And he had said that in effect he'd become victim of his own success. They'd grown so big that they didn't have the outlets for their meat. This therefore set me to think about my own business back at home. I too am a price taker, having to accept the price of beef that they offer at the local abattoir, so it's made me focus on the cost of my inputs a lot more. In the feedlots, the cattle were fed on genetically modified crops. And my Nuffield Association got me through the doors of the Monsanto Centre in St. Louis. Here I witnessed no end of different trials. Not only are they getting grain to grow in salt-resistant conditions, but also drought-resistant crops were being achieved as well, whereby they were identifying various genes in cactus and transferring them back to corn. They are also conducting trials on Roundup-resistant crops as well, and have been licensed to produce Roundup-resistant soybean. Growth promoters and hormones are also used over in America, and I felt quite a grievance actually that we couldn't use them in the EU. So I asked Dr. Galen Erickson from the Lincoln State University whether or not they were actually efficient. He said that cattle fattened with the use of growth promoters actually require 10% less grain than those that haven't been administered them. I then asked him if they were safe, and he said perfectly. In fact, the hormone levels in meat could be comparable to a blade of grass on a football field. So why had they been banned in the EU, I questioned him. And he said it was pure protectionism, because if we'd been allowed to use them in our country, we would have no excuse for banning the imports of their meat into the EU, which would then put our producers out of business. Can anybody tell me why I've included this picture in my presentation? And I'll tell you now, it's not to show an example of bovine graffiti, nor is it to show you that the girl at the feedlot took a shine to me, but it's to show you the conditions that some of the cattle are kept in, quite often kept in 2 foot of muck. I went to several abattoirs in the United States, but none more impressive than the big one at Schuyler. Here, 4,800 cattle were fattened at any one time. Most of these cattle were brought in on the eve of their slaughter and lairaged. In the morning, they were sprayed with water, which not only served to keep them cool, but it also served to pacify them as well, so that as they went down to the slaughter chute, they wouldn't ride each other. Here, in the slaughter chute, they were elevated off their feet by a conveyor belt that ran up between their legs, and they were transferred forward to the slaughterman. Having been dispatched, they were then hung up by their back leg and bled out. They were then power hosed off with hot water. And I said to the manager, this would never be allowed in our country. And indeed, I have to belly clip all mine before I present them to the abattoir. Not only is this practice dangerous to me, the operator, it is also very, very stressful to the animal concerned. I therefore conclude that members of our beef industry should go over to America and take a leaf out of their book. I think that the belly clipping could be very easily outlawed. I mentioned that stress plays a large part in the slaughter process, but I had a very interesting conversation with Dr. Temple Grandin, who said that quieter animals are fattened much more efficiently, which leads me very nicely to talk about my favourite visit of all of them. That's at the Clay Centre, the United States Meat and Animal Research Centre, where they were conducting experiments to try and isolate the docility gene on the genotype, in the hope that one day they would be able to create a perfectly docile animal that would fatten much more efficiently. I also went to New Zealand to witness a different type of cattle fattening system, that of a pastorally based system. Here, large mobs of cattle, usually Holstein bulls from the dairy herd, are kept in very small paddocks, encased in electric fencing. Every day, they're rotated around the system, and they're able to eat very lush and fertile grass. And some very, very commendable live weight gains in excess of 2 kilos a day could be achieved. I recognise that this system depends very much on docile animals, and its application in our country might be slightly marred in the fact that we have very fiery continentals that might not respect the electric fencing. That said though, I brought the application back to my farm, and 3 times last year I topped our pastures to encourage lush growth. In New Zealand, I witnessed some very interesting environmental projects, and also the miracle. Next one, please. Here, driving through the central plains of South Island, New Zealand, it was an area of extreme aridness and alluvial riverbeds. I came across at the central irrigator, and underneath its shadow I could see cattle very contentedly grazing grass at 2 foot tall. Ladies and gentlemen, you can see that it is my horizons have been broadened, and I've been taught to look beyond the box. Whilst I was in America, I landed on the day of the earthquake, and I witnessed the devastation that it had caused. This sowed the seed for an idea, that of recycling plastic, which I could then make into flat-pack, cheap and affordable shelters, which could be sent to war and disaster zones. I've also dug out a nice big pool at home, which not only serves as an environmental feature, but also as a source of water, and also a potential tourist attraction. Everybody I spoke to out there that was successful seemed to concentrate most on the activities around them closest to them. And on that front, I currently have an application lodged with Shropshire District Council to build 7 houses on our property. So as you can see, I'm a different man from my Nuffield experience. I've been entirely enlightened. I'd like to thank the Nuffield Foundation Scholarship Trust for recognising something in me that day of my interview, and for the John Oldacre Foundation Trust for very kindly sponsoring me. I'd also like to thank Mum and Dad, both in their 70s, for holding the fort whilst I was away. But my final thought, ladies and gentlemen, goes to Lord Nuffield himself. And if it wasn't for his foresight and generosity, none of us would be here this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you this afternoon wearing this tie. I'm an extremely proud man to be part of his legacy. Thank you very much indeed.